The chair scraped against the floor of the conclave chamber and every head in the room turned. Not because the sound was loud. Because a human had made it. My name is Sarah Voss. I am the first human being to sit inside the Galactic Council's grand negotiating hall on the station above Kepler's cradle, and I want to be honest with you right now, before I tell you how everything unfolded. I almost did not come. Not because I was afraid. Because I had read the briefing files, all 400 pages of them, and I knew exactly what the Council thought of us before I had even stepped off the transport ship. They thought we were children. They thought we were a footnote. They thought we were a species that had stumbled into deep space 80 years ago and been lucky enough not to destroy ourselves yet. The briefing files did not say this directly. Diplomatic language never does. But when a document describes humanity's entry into interstellar civilization as premature but manageable, you understand the tone. The conclave chamber was enormous. It was built to make you feel small, which told you something about the species that had designed it. The ceiling was 300 feet above the floor, carved from a single slab of dark Vorkai stone, etched with the names of every treaty the Galactic Council had ever brokered. There were thousands of names. Some of them were wars that had ended before Earth had learned to write. I sat at the far end of the observers' table, which was separated from the main council floor by a low railing that I had been told, politely and firmly, I was not to cross. My colleague, a diplomatic analyst named Owen Garrett, sat beside me with a data tablet balanced on his knee. Owen was 26 years old, brilliant, and had the specific talent of looking completely calm while being completely furious. I had hired him for exactly that skill. The 12 council seats were arranged in a half-circle around a central speaking platform. The Vorkai delegation occupied the 3 most prominent chairs, which was not an accident. The Vorkai were the oldest of the 12 represented species, and they carried that age the way some people carry wealth, loudly and with the expectation that you would notice. Their lead representative was a figure called Counselor Drath, and Drath had a way of looking at you that made you feel like a curious insect that had wandered onto a clean surface. Drath looked at me that way when I entered the chamber. Then he said something to the HFY delegate beside him, and the HFY delegate made a sound that the translation system rendered as a soft laugh. I had been told what Drath said. My personal translation receiver was running before I sat down. He said, "The mammalians have sent someone small." He was not talking about my height. Owen placed his tablet down very carefully and looked at the ceiling. I opened my briefing folder and began to read, because if I looked at Drath at that moment, the entire mission would have ended before it started. We were here because of the Ferris Corridor. That was the truth behind all the careful language about humanity's role as a neutral mediator. The Ferris Corridor was a hyperspace relay route that passed through the outer edge of Earth's solar system, and every major faction in the Council needed it for trade. Medical supplies moved through it. Military logistics moved through it. The rare materials that kept Vorkai cities lit and HFY engines running moved through it. Humanity had built the relay infrastructure over 40 years, quietly and efficiently, and humanity controlled the licensing. The Council hated that. Not because we had done anything wrong. Because we had done something right, and they had not seen it coming. A species they had assumed was irrelevant had become, without anyone giving them permission, necessary. So they invited us to mediate the Keth frontier dispute. The Keth frontier was a contested buffer zone between 3 species who had been fighting a cold war for 60 years, with occasional bursts of real violence. The Council needed the conflict resolved. They needed a mediator clean of political ties to any faction. And they needed that mediator to be someone they could control, someone who would sign whatever was put in front of them without reading the fine print. They chose humanity. I understood this before the transport ship docked. I understood it when they assigned us the observers' table behind the railing. I understood it when the welcome documents arrived and the listed role for the human delegation was, word for word, facilitating consensus. Facilitating consensus. Not negotiating. Not proposing. Not deciding. Facilitating. Like we were furniture that could fetch coffee. Owen had read the same documents. On the transport ship, the night before docking, he had looked at me over the small table in our shared cabin and said, "They're going to try to use us as a rubber stamp." "Yes," I said. "And we're going to let them believe they can," he said. "Yes," I said. And then I closed the briefing folder. We'll see what they're worth. The first session of negotiations opened at 9 in the morning, station time. The three Keth frontier factions entered the chamber in their separate delegations, each one careful not to acknowledge the others. The Soreth wore their ceremonial armor even inside a negotiating room, which was a statement. The Pulhari came in 3 by 3 with synchronized steps, which was also a statement. The Dine entered last and sat in absolute silence, and their silence was the loudest statement of all. I watched all of it from behind my railing. I had a notepad. I had a stylus. I had 400 pages of background files loaded into my tablet. I began to take notes, and I was very, very careful to make sure those notes were thorough. Because someone in that room was going to underestimate how carefully I was reading. And when that happened, I intended to be ready. The session lasted 9 hours. In those 9 hours, the three Keth factions made their opening statements, accused each other of 17 separate violations of prior agreements, and proposed 3 frameworks that were each completely unacceptable to the other 2. The Vorkai counselors mediated with practiced patience. They were good at this. They had been doing it for centuries. At the end of the session, Drath looked across the chamber at the observers' table. He looked at me the way a teacher looks at a child who has been sitting quietly in the back of the classroom and says, "Any questions?" I looked up from my notes. "Not yet," I said. He turned away. Beside me, Owen was very carefully not smiling. "Not yet." That was all. 2 words. But they were mine, and I had meant them, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I was already counting the days. There is a specific kind of quiet that settles over you when you realize that the people around you have already decided who you are, and they have decided wrong. It is not a comfortable quiet. It is the kind that sits in your chest like a held breath. You can sustain it for a long time if you know what you are holding it for. I had been sustaining it for 6 weeks. The day the real mockery began was day 40 of the negotiations. I remember it precisely because I had been writing in my personal log every evening, and that morning I had written a single sentence before the session started. I wrote, "Something is about to break." I did not know yet what it would be, or who would do the breaking. I found out within the first hour. The Vorkai delegation had tabled a new procedural rule overnight. It stated that all non-council parties in the observer section were required to submit their proposed contributions in written form 48 hours before any session in which they wished to speak. This was new. This had not been part of the original framework. Owen flagged it in our shared document at 7 in the morning with a single comment, "They're sealing us out." He was right. The 48-hour rule made it impossible for us to respond to anything that happened in real time. We could submit a comment today that would be relevant 3 days from now, if the negotiation moved in a straight line, which no negotiation in history ever had. It was not a debate restriction. It was a gag rule dressed in procedural language. I submitted a formal objection to the Secretariat before breakfast. The Secretariat acknowledged receipt. No one responded further. That same morning, during the opening remarks, something else happened. The Hesari delegation had leaked a document to the press corps attached to the station. The document was described as an internal human diplomatic memo outlining Earth's proposed solution to the Keth civilian population question. According to the leaked version, humanity had suggested that displaced Keth Soreth civilians be relocated to a secondary system in Hesari space. I had not written that memo. No one in our delegation had written that memo. The document was a fabrication, and it had been constructed carefully enough to look real at a distance, with the right header formatting and the right reference numbers. By the time I saw it on the news feed, it had already been picked up by 6 separate outlets and attributed to Earth's diplomatic office. Owen read it on his tablet and set the tablet down on the table with both hands. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "They want us to deny it." "Yes," I said. "And when we deny it, we look defensive. And when we look defensive, the factions see us as partisan." "Yes. So we can't deny it in session. We already sent a statement to the press corps. 30 minutes ago. I had drafted it on the transport from my quarters. 11 sentences. Factual. No emotion. The kind of statement that is impossible to argue with because it contains nothing but verifiable facts, including the metadata from our actual internal documents showing the fabricated memo could not have been generated by our systems. Owen picked his tablet back up. They'll ignore it. Some will. Some won't. The ones who won't are the ones I'm talking to. He looked at me for a moment. Who are you talking to? I turned a page in my briefing folder. Everyone who isn't in this chamber. Session 40 opened with the usual procedural formalities. Drath took his place at the head of the half circle and called the room to order, and the Vorkai translation system hummed to life with its familiar low resonance. I had learned to listen to that resonance the way you learn to listen to background noise in a building, not consciously, but always. The opening remarks from the three factions were tense. The Sorith had issued a counterstatement about the leaked memo and were using it to reopen questions about human neutrality. The Pulhari said nothing about it directly but referenced outside interference 3 times in 4 minutes, which was its own kind of statement. The Dine sat in their usual silence and watched everything. I sat behind my railing and wrote in my notebook and said nothing. Then Drath spoke. He was discussing the framework for civilian protection zones, and he was doing it well, and he turned slightly toward the observer section in that practiced way of his that was not quite acknowledgement but was meant to remind you that he was aware of your presence. And then, in the middle of his remarks, without pausing or changing his tone, he said, "Perhaps we should wait for the Sol 3 delegation to consult their planetary advisors before we proceed further. I understand decision-making is complex when one has not yet evolved sufficiently to grasp the burden of galactic responsibility." The chamber laughed. Not all of it. But enough. The Pulhari delegation laughed. 2 of the Vorkai junior delegates laughed. One of the Hesari observers, a young official named Kreth who had been friendly with Owen in the corridor, looked at the floor. The translation system rendered the laughter faithfully. It rendered every word of Drath's remark faithfully. The system had no opinion. It simply did its job, and its job was to make sure I heard exactly what was said and understood exactly what was meant. I did not look up from my notebook. I wrote 1 line. I dated it, noted the session number, and I wrote, Day 40. Drath, open session, unprovoked. Recorded. Then I turned the page and kept writing my notes, because the session was still going and there was still work to do, and I was not done reading what was written in this room. Not even close. Owen sat beside me without moving. Later, when the session broke for the midday recess, he walked with me to the corridor and said nothing for a full 2 minutes. We stood at the window overlooking the station's lower deck, watching small transport ships move between docking arms. Then he said, "That was calculated." Yes. He wanted a reaction. Yes. Are you going to give him one? I looked at the ships below. Each one was small from this height. Each one was moving with precise, careful purpose, carrying something that mattered to someone, somewhere, along a route that someone had built and someone maintained. Not today, I said. I come to Earth that evening. Not a formal report, those went through the secure diplomatic channel. A personal call to Director Lena Holt, who had been my supervisor for 12 years and who was the only person in the government who would tell me the truth without softening it first. Lena answered from her office in Geneva. It was early morning there. She had a coffee and a look on her face that told me she had already read the day's session transcript. Drath, she said. Drath, I confirmed. And the fabricated memo? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone thinking. The quiet of someone who has already thought and is deciding how much to say. Sarah, she said, I need you to hold. Command wants patience. They're calculating the corridor leverage against the diplomatic cost of escalation. It's delicate. I know, I said. They're not ignoring what's happening. They're watching. I know, I said again. She looked at me through the screen. How are you holding up? I thought about the laughter in the chamber. I thought about the 48-hour rule. I thought about the fabricated memo and the way Kreth had looked at the floor. I'm reading, I said. Still reading. Lena half smiled. She knew what that meant. She was the one who had told me, years ago, that the most dangerous thing a negotiator can do is read everything, because once you've read everything, you can't pretend you didn't. I had read everything. I knew exactly what was in the draft annexes that the Council had quietly circulated to member states but not to the observer section. I had obtained a copy through a contact in the Thalessi Secretariat, a junior attaché named Mira Osei, who had handed me a data chip in the station's lower deck cafeteria with the specific body language of someone doing something they believed was right and were not sure was wise. The annexes contained a clause. 3 paragraphs, buried in subsection 14 of the Trade Framework, that revised the licensing terms for the Ferris Corridor. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would be obvious at first reading. But the revision restructured the usage fee calculation in a way that would, over a period of 20 years, transfer effective pricing control from Earth's relay authority to a council-administered body. It was not a seizure. It was slower than that. It was the kind of move that only works on someone who is not reading carefully, or someone who has decided that signing is better than fighting. I had read it 4 times. I had sent a copy to Lena's secure channel with a single note, subsection 14. Read it slowly. She had read it. Command had read it. And they had told me to hold. I held. I sat behind my railing for 7 more days. I submitted 3 formal contributions through the 48-hour process. 1 was ignored. 1 was acknowledged and tabled. 1 was read aloud in session by a Vorkai junior delegate who then described it as a helpful perspective from our observing partners, in the tone of voice that a person uses when they mean exactly the opposite. On day 47, the Hesari delegation proposed an updated version of the draft framework. It incorporated subsection 14 with minor cosmetic changes. The 3 Keth factions were shown the document. The Soreth objected to 1 clause about territorial markers. The Pulhari wanted a longer implementation timeline. The Dine said nothing. The Council scheduled a final ratification session for day 50. They sent the Observer section a courtesy notification. Not an invitation. A notification. The difference was architectural. Owen read the notification on his tablet. He set it down. He looked at me. I was already writing a comm to Earth. Not a report. Not a formal channel request. I was writing a message to Lena Holt that said 4 words, I think it's time. The response came 6 hours later. It was not from Lena. It was from Director of Strategic Affairs, Philip Crane, who I had met twice in person and who was the kind of official who signs things. His message was short. It said, Parliament voted this morning. We agree. Your judgment, Ambassador. Trust it. I read that message standing at the window of my quarters, looking out at the station's outer ring where Earth's transport ships were docked. 14 of them. More than any other species. Because we were here, and we had come prepared, and we had never intended to be furniture. I turned away from the window and sat at my desk. I began to write. Day 50 arrived the way all important days do, ordinary on the surface and enormous underneath. The corridor outside the conclave chamber was busy with delegations arriving, press corps adjusting equipment, junior officials carrying folders and moving quickly in that specific way that meant their superiors were nervous. There is always a particular energy in a room before a ratification session. Something between celebration and relief, the feeling of people who believe that a long, difficult thing is nearly over. Owen and I arrived exactly on time. Not early. Not late. On time, which is its own kind of message when everyone else has been there for an hour. We walked past the press area. 3 journalists called out to me. I did not stop. I had already spoken to the press. My statement had gone out 2 hours earlier through Earth's diplomatic channel, distributed to every outlet on the station simultaneously. I had written it the night before, after the response from Director Crane, sitting at my desk in a quiet room with a glass of water and no one watching. I did not want anyone watching when I wrote it. Some things need to be written in private. The chamber filled. The Keth factions took their places. The council members settled into their half-circle seats. Drath sat at the center with the calm of someone who believes the day is already decided. I walked to the observer's table. I placed my briefing folder on the table. I placed my notebook beside it. I set down my stylus. And then I did not sit down. Owen stood beside me. He had not sat down either. Drath noticed. His gaze moved to our section with the careful, controlled interest of someone who does not want to show that they have noticed, and has noticed anyway. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and removed a data chip. It was a standard diplomatic-grade chip, the kind used for official submissions throughout the station. I had prepared it the night before with the same care I had used for everything else in this room. I walked to the council floor. I did not stop at the railing. I stepped past it. There was a moment of absolute silence. I crossed the floor and placed the data chip on the edge of the central speaking platform where every delegation could see it. Then I stepped back. "This is Earth's formal withdrawal from the Keth frontier negotiations," I said. "It includes the suspension of preferential access to the Ferris Corridor for all Council member states, effective in 72 hours, pending review. It also includes a 90-day trade review with all bilateral partners currently operating under Council framework agreements." I paused. The room was so quiet that I could hear the translation system's low hum. "We came here to help," I said. "We prepared for 6 weeks before arriving. We read every document, every annex, every subsection. We offered frameworks. We observed the process. We held our objections through procedural barriers that were designed specifically to silence us. We were patient." I looked at Drath. "We watched you use our presence as legitimacy for an outcome you had already decided. We watched you revise trade agreements in documents you did not share with us. We watched a fabricated memo get distributed without consequence. We watched this process be called negotiation while it was, in fact, a performance." Drath's expression had not changed. That told me more than any expression would have. "Humanity does not need a seat at a table that is being used against us," I said. "We came here to help resolve a conflict. If the purpose of our presence is to stamp a document that harms our interests while giving the outcome the appearance of neutral endorsement, then our presence ends now." I picked up my briefing folder. I picked up my notebook. I picked up my stylus. "The Ferris Corridor review begins at midnight, station time. Our bilateral contacts will receive individual communications within the hour." I looked around the chamber. The Keth factions were motionless. The council members were not. Some of them were already reaching for communication devices. Kreth, the young Hesari official who had looked at the floor on day 40, was looking at me now. Not with shock. With something that might have been recognition. "Thank you for the 47 days, I said. "We learned a great deal." I walked toward the door. Owen fell into step beside me. We did not look back. In the corridor, we passed the press area. Every journalist in the station was looking at a screen or a device, because the statement had hit their feeds the moment I spoke, auto-released on a timer I had set at midnight. The cameras came up. The questions started. I did not stop. I kept walking, and Owen kept pace, and behind us the conclave chamber was making a sound that the translation system, had it been pointed in our direction, would have rendered as chaos. We had told no one we were going. No advance notice to the council, no coordinating with the Keth factions, no warning to the Secretariat. 48 hours of formal notice was their rule, not ours. We had submitted nothing in advance because we were not proposing something. We were ending something. The transport bay was on the station's lower level. Our 14 ships were ready. I had arranged that the night before as well. Owen spoke for the first time since we had left the chamber. He said, "The Vorkai are going to panic." "Yes," I said. "The Hesari are going to deny the memo thing." "They already are." "Check your feed." He checked. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. 3 minutes. "The Polhari are going to file a formal complaint. They can file it to our remote office. We'll have someone read it within the week." We reached the transport bay. The officer on duty, a young woman named Claire Ashby who had been with our delegation since day one and who had the specific quality of competence that asks no unnecessary questions, confirmed the bay was ready and the departure window was open. I stopped at the bay entrance and looked back down the corridor. Far down, at the other end, a Vorkai official was running. I had never seen a Vorkai move that fast. They were a very dignified species. The dignity, it seemed, had a limit. Owen watched the running figure and said, "Do you want to wait for them?" "No," I said. "They know where we live." We walked into the transport bay, and the door sealed behind us, and we went home. 72 hours after the conclave chamber door closed behind us, the Ferris Corridor Access Review went into effect. This was not a shutdown. That is important to understand. Earth did not close the corridor. Earth simply stopped processing preferential rate licenses for Council member states, which meant that those states now had to use the standard commercial licensing queue, which had a processing time of 6 to 14 weeks, depending on cargo classification. 6 to 14 weeks. That was all. The first emergency message arrived from the Vorkai diplomatic office 23 minutes after midnight. I was in my office in Geneva by then, because we had made good time and I do not sleep well on transports. Lena was across the desk from me. Philip Crane had sent a liaison. The message from the Vorkai was forwarded to me by our remote office flagged as priority. I read it. I set it aside. What does it say? Lena asked. It requests an urgent resumption of dialogue. Lena raised her eyebrows slightly. That was fast. There are 7 more, I said. 3 Hesari, 2 Pulhari, 1 from a Sorath trade representative, and 1 from the Thalessi Secretariat. Lena was quiet for a moment. The Thalessi. Yes. They weren't involved in the mockery. No, I said. They were not. The Thalessi message was different from the others. It was shorter, and it did not use the urgent flag, and it was signed by Mira Osei, the junior attaché who had handed me the data chip in the cafeteria. The message said, simply, for what it is worth, what you did was correct. There are some of us here who have been waiting for someone to do it. I read that message 3 times. Then I filed it carefully in a separate folder that I labeled, privately, useful. The days that followed were busy in a way that had nothing to do with the conclave chamber. The 90-day bilateral review had activated 12 conversations simultaneously, and our diplomatic office was running around the clock. Owen coordinated the communications from his own office, which he had apparently not left for 36 hours based on the timestamps on his messages. He sent me a single summary note on the 3rd day that read, "For non-council species have asked for bilateral meetings. 2 of them were specifically excluded from the Keth process. They would like to discuss trade agreements." I wrote back, "Schedule them." He wrote back, "Already did." The Keth frontier, meanwhile, had stopped being a Cold War. Without the human delegation present as a shared target for the factions to redirect their objections toward, and without the council framework providing even the illusion of structure, the 3 factions fell back into what they had actually been doing for 60 years, which was failing to agree on anything. Within 10 days of our departure, the Sorath had pulled their delegation from the conclave entirely. The Pulhari and the Dine were still in the chamber, talking to each other through the Vorkai mediators, but the agreement they were discussing bore no resemblance to the document that had been prepared for ratification on day 50. The council issued a public statement calling the situation a temporary setback in the pursuit of lasting peace, which was the specific kind of language that means things have fallen apart. Philip Crane came to see me in person on day 12. He sat across from me in my Geneva office and said, without preamble, "The Vorkai have requested a direct call with the Director General." "I know," I said. "I saw the request. The Director General wants your assessment before he responds." I looked at the window. Outside, it was raining, the kind of steady gray rain that Geneva does reliably in late autumn, the kind that makes everything look considered and settled. "Tell the Director General to wait 11 more days," I said. Crane blinked. 11 days. The Hesari supply chain for Vorkai medical processors runs through the corridor. The processing queue will clear their most recent urgent shipment in 11 days. After that, the next batch goes into the 6 to 14 week window. Tell the Director General to take the call on day 12. Crane was quiet for a moment. He had a specific quality that I had noticed in both our meetings, the quality of a man who is re-evaluating something he thought he already understood. "You're giving them a demonstration," he said. "I'm giving them information," I said. "What they do with it is their business." He stood to leave. At the door, he paused. "Parliament wants to know what you're asking for." "We're not asking," I said. "We'll be ready to discuss when they're ready to negotiate." Those are different things. When they understand the difference, they'll know it's time to call. Crane left. "Lena, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the office for the last 10 minutes, looked at me over the rim of her coffee cup. 11 days, she said. 11 days, I confirmed. You counted exactly. I counted exactly. She drank her coffee. Then she said, Mira Osei sent another message. I looked at her. What did it say? She has been reassigned. The Thalessi have a new senior envoy position opening in their bilateral office. She asked if Earth would be open to receiving her as a contact. I thought about Kreth looking at the floor. I thought about Myra's data chip and the quiet courage of handing it over in a cafeteria. I thought about all the people in that chamber who were not Drath, who had been sitting in those seats for careers and decades and who had also, somewhere in the back of their minds, been waiting for something to change. Tell her yes, I said. On day 23 of the review period, I was in my office when Owen walked in without knocking, which meant something had happened. He was carrying his tablet and he had the specific expression of someone who has not slept and has just seen something that made the sleeplessness worth it. He handed me the tablet. On the screen was a news report from the station above Kepler's cradle. It was a short item, 2 paragraphs. The Vorkai Council had announced the appointment of a new lead mediator for the Keth frontier process. The new mediator was not Drath. I read it twice. Who replaced him? I asked. The Thalessi nomination, Owen said. A senior figure named Counselor Veth. She was on the Thalessi delegation during the process but stayed in the background. She has a record of pushing for broader representation in council frameworks. I set the tablet down. I thought about Myra's message. I thought about Kreth. I thought about the specific ecology of an institution in the moment when it realizes it has made an error, and which parts of it move first to correct the course. The Thalessi nominated her, I said. Yes. And 4 other council states seconded the nomination within the hour. 4 states. Not a majority. But a beginning. I looked out at the rain. It was still coming down steadily, patient and certain, the kind of weather that knows exactly where it is going. Owen, I said. Yes. Schedule the Director General's call with the Vorkai. For day 12, as you said. No, I said. Schedule it for tomorrow morning. He paused. Why tomorrow? I turned from the window. Because Drath is gone and Veth is in, and the 4 states that seconded the nomination are the same 4 states whose medical supply chains are most affected by the Q delay. They moved fast. That means they understand. If they understand, we don't need to wait. Owen looked at me for a moment. You changed the timeline. The situation changed, I said. We respond to what's actually happening, not to the plan we made before it happened. That's the difference between a strategy and a script. He nodded slowly. Then he said, what do we tell them when they call? I picked up my stylus and opened my notebook to a clean page. We tell them we're ready to discuss a new framework, I said. On our terms, at our location, with full delegation status, no observer railing, and the subsection 14 language removed from any draft that enters the room. Owen wrote it down. Then he looked up. And if they push back on our location? Then we remind them, I said, that the Ferris corridor has a very long processing queue. He allowed himself a real smile at that. The first one I had seen from him in 23 days. I'll schedule the call, he said, and left. I sat alone in my office in the Geneva rain, with my notebook open and my stylus in my hand, and I thought about a chamber 300 light-years away and a ceiling carved with the names of every piece that had ever been made in that room. We were going to add a name to it. But it would be our name, under our terms, and it would mean exactly what it said. That, I thought, was worth the wait. The call from the Vorkai diplomatic office came at 7 a.m, Geneva time. It was routed through Earth's new priority channel, the one our communications team had set up during the review period specifically for corridor-adjacent matters. The channel required both parties to confirm identity through a 3-step protocol, which meant that by the time the connection opened, everyone on both ends knew exactly who they were talking to. The new Vorkai lead on the diplomatic channel was not Drath. It was a figure named Counselor Reth, who I had not spoken to before but whose file I had read. Reth was younger than Drath by several decades, career-tracked as a trade specialist rather than a political mediator, and had a record that described her as outcomes-focused. In the diplomatic community, outcomes-focused is a compliment. It means the person cares about what actually happens, not about who appears to have been right. Ambassador Voss, she said, when the connection opened. Thank you for accepting this call. Thank you for making it, I said. I understand you have a new appointment. A brief pause. Yes. There have been some internal changes. I heard. Congratulations to Counselor Veth. Another pause. Slightly longer. You know about Veth. I know about most things, I said, pleasantly. The conversation that followed was 45 minutes long. It was, by the standards of interstellar diplomacy, extremely short. Veth was direct. She confirmed that the Council understood Earth's objections to the Keth framework. She confirmed that the draft annexes were being reviewed. She used the phrase, procedural overreach, twice, which in Vorkai diplomatic language is the equivalent of an apology. I did not accept the apology, because she had not actually offered one. I noted the phrase and moved on. Earth is prepared to rejoin a revised negotiation process, I said, under the following conditions. Full delegation status, with speaking rights in all sessions. Location in Earth-administered space. No pre-submission rule on observer contributions. And complete removal of the corridor licensing language from the draft framework. Veth was quiet for a moment. The location requirement will require Council approval. I understand. The licensing language was not proposed by the Vorkai. The HFY drafted it. I understand that too, I said. It will need to be removed regardless of who proposed it. That is a significant ask. Yes, I said. It is. She was quiet again. Through the connection, I could hear the faint background sounds of her office, which told me she had not routed this call through the standard soundproof diplomatic room. She was calling from her working space. That was information. I believe these terms can be met, she said finally. I will need to take them back to the full Council. Of course, I said. We'll wait. After the call ended, Owen came into my office. He had been listening from the adjacent room. She said they can be met, he said. She said she believes they can be met, I said. That's not the same thing. But it's close enough to begin. The Council's formal response came 4 days later. It was 30 pages long and written in the precise, layered language of Vorkai official correspondence, the kind that requires 3 readings and a reference document to fully parse. Owen read it first and summarized it for me in 6 words, they agreed to everything you asked. I read it myself. He was right. Earth's parliament voted to resume negotiations the following morning. The vote was not unanimous. There were members who argued that walking out had been reckless, that we had risked essential trade relationships for the sake of dignity. They were not wrong that there had been risk. But they had not read the subsection 14 language, or if they had decided that managing it quietly was better than confronting it openly. I had been asked to speak to the parliamentary committee before the vote. I had said, simply, if we sign a document that harms our long-term interests because we are afraid of a short-term difficulty, we will spend the next 50 years managing the consequences of that fear. If we hold our position and renegotiate from a foundation of mutual respect, we will spend the next 50 years building something worth keeping. The vote passed with a strong majority. The new negotiations were scheduled to open at Lunar Station Tycho, in Earth-controlled space. This was the first time in the Galactic Council's recorded history that a major multilateral negotiation had been hosted outside of Council-administered territory. The Council's public statement called it a flexible and adaptive approach to consensus building. In private, Mira Osei, who was now settled into her new bilateral contact role, sent me a message that said, half the station is calling it the Voss precedent. The other half is pretending it was their idea. I filed that message in the folder labeled useful and went to work. Lunar Station Tycho was smaller than the conclave above Kepler's cradle, and it did not have a ceiling carved from Vorkai stone. It had standard corridor lighting and a cafeteria that served good food and a view of the Earth that, depending on where you were in the station's rotation, filled the entire observation window with blue and white and the quiet certainty of something enormous that had been there a very long time. I had requested the main negotiating chamber be arranged differently from the conclave's half-circle design. Round table. All delegations at the same level. No observer section. No railing. The Vorkai delegation arrived first. Counselor Veth led them in. She was taller than I expected, and she had the unhurried quality of someone who has spent a long career learning when to speak and when to simply be present. She crossed the chamber and offered me her hand in the human style, which she had clearly researched, and when I shook it she said, "Ambassador Voss. I have been looking forward to this." "As have I," I said. The Keth factions arrived separately. The Soreth were still wearing their ceremonial armor. Some things were consistent. The Pulhari came in 3 by 3. The Dine came in last and sat in their silence, but this time the silence felt different. It felt, for the first time, like attention rather than distance. The 4 non-council species who had requested bilateral meetings with Earth sat at the table as full participants, not observers. This had been Owen's idea, and it had been the right one. Their presence changed the shape of the room. Not because they were powerful, though 2 of them were growing quickly, but because their presence meant that the Keth frontier was now being discussed in a room that was larger than the council's usual circle of influence. Drath was not present. He had not been named to the new Vorkai delegation. I had not asked about him. Some things resolve themselves when you stop making them the center of the problem. I opened the session. Not Veth, not the senior Vorkai member, not a procedural officer. Me. I opened it, because this was Earth's station and Earth's framework, and we had earned the chair at the head of the table by being the only party in the original process who had read everything, offered honestly, and left when the process became dishonest. "We are here," I said, "to resolve a conflict that has been ongoing for 60 years and has cost lives that deserved better. The people of the Keth frontier have been waiting for this outcome longer than most of the people in this room have been involved in diplomacy. We owe them an agreement that is real, that is enforceable, and that was reached with integrity. That is what we are here to build." The room was quiet. Not the aggressive quiet of the conclave. The quiet of people who are ready to do something difficult and have decided to do it honestly. We worked for 11 days. The framework that emerged was different from the document that had been prepared for ratification at the conclave on day 50. It was simpler. It had fewer clauses and more specifics. The civilian protection terms were concrete rather than aspirational. The territorial boundary adjustments were mutual rather than imposed. The implementation timeline was realistic because Owen had insisted we build it from the ground up with the actual logistics people rather than from the top down with theoretical timelines. On the morning of the 12th day, I placed the final text of the Keth Frontier Framework on the table. It was 43 pages. I had read every word of it, twice, the night before. Each delegation signed in turn. The Soreth first, which surprised me. Their lead representative signed without theatrics, a clean mark at the bottom of the page, and then sat back with the contained relief of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been allowed to put it down. The Pulhari signed. The Dine signed, in their quiet, certain way. The 4 non-council species signed as guarantors. The Vorkai signed through Counselor Veth, who signed with a steady hand and then looked up at me briefly and said nothing, but the look said enough. The Hesari representative signed and then cleared his throat and said, into the room, that the Hesari government wished to formally acknowledge that certain prior actions in the earlier negotiation process had not reflected the standards of conduct expected within the council framework. He used the word regret. He used it once, precisely, and then stopped speaking. He did not look at me. He looked at the table. I let him. It was not an apology, exactly. But it was the part before an apology, the part where someone decides they can live with saying the true thing. That takes something. I noted it. When the last signature was on the document, I sat in my chair and looked around the table. Outside the observation window, the Earth was rising over the lunar horizon, slow and inevitable and indifferent to the specific hour, because the Earth does not care about hours. It has been rising over things for a very long time and will continue to do so long after all the documents in all the chambers in all the stations orbiting all the stars have turned to memory. Owen appeared beside me. He looked at the window too. Then he said, quietly, "It's done." "It's done," I agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Was it worth it?" The walkout. The 72 days. All of it. I thought about the laughter in the conclave chamber. I thought about the translation system rendering every word of it faithfully, because the system had no opinion. I thought about Mira and her data chip and the courage that looks like a small thing until you understand exactly what it cost. I thought about Kreth looking at the floor and then looking up. I thought about the parliamentary committee member who had asked me if it was worth the risk, and the answer I had not given him. I thought about the 43 pages on the table, and the 60 years they had ended, and the lives in the Keth frontier that would be different now, for the people who would never know this table existed and would simply one day discover that the war had stopped. Yes, I said. It was worth it. Owen nodded. He picked up his tablet and began writing his debrief. He was already thinking about the next thing, which was correct, because there is always a next thing. I stayed at the window a moment longer. The earth continued rising. There is something they teach you in the first year of diplomatic training, a principle that sounds simple until you have spent enough time in rooms where it is tested. It is this: respect is not given by the powerful to the less powerful unless the less powerful makes it clear that the alternative is worse. I had learned that in a classroom. I had always believed it in theory. But I had not known it in my body, the way you know a true thing, until I stood up from an observer's chair and crossed a railing I had been told not to cross and placed a data chip on a platform and said what I said and walked out of a room that was still laughing at the species that had just ended their session. We are young. Every species that has been out among the stars for centuries likes to remind us of this. They are right. We are young. 80 years in deep space is nothing against a civilization that has been traveling between stars for 1,000. But we built the Ferris Corridor. We built it because we saw a need and we filled it, quietly and practically and without asking anyone's permission. We read every document that was put in front of us, including the ones we were not supposed to have. We held our patience in a room full of people who were betting on it breaking. And when the time came, we did not shout or threaten or demand. We simply picked up our things and left. And when they asked us to come back, we came back with our own conditions and our own table and our own terms, and the agreement we made in that room was better than the one they had prepared for us to sign. That is not the story of a species that needs to be told it has arrived. That is the story of a species that was never waiting for permission to arrive. When I finally left the station, I took a transport back to Geneva. It was a quiet flight. Owen slept. Most of the delegation slept. I sat at the small window and watched the earth grow larger as we descended, the way it always does, slowly and then all at once. Claire Ashby, who had been our Bay officer since day one at the conclave, came to sit across from me somewhere over the Atlantic. She had a cup of tea. She offered me one. I accepted. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "My brother asked me what it felt like being part of all this." "What did you tell him?" I asked. She thought about it. I told him it felt like watching someone refuse to apologize for existing. I held my cup. Outside, the clouds moved. Far below them, somewhere, were cities and roads and people who did not know what had happened in a room on a station above the moon, and whose lives were slightly better for it anyway. "That's not bad," I said. He asked if that was a good thing. "What did you say?" She looked out the window. I said I thought it was the only thing. We landed in Geneva as the sun was going down, that particular late afternoon light that makes everything look like it has just been decided. I had a report to write, and a debrief to give, and a parliamentary address scheduled for the following week, and 4 bilateral meetings that Owen had already arranged with the non-council species who had signed the framework. There was a great deal of work left. I had known, from the moment I placed the data chip on the speaking platform, that walking out of the chamber was not the end. It was a door. Doors open into things. The things on the other side are not always simple. But they are navigable, if you are willing to read carefully, move deliberately, and understand that patience is not the same thing as passivity. Patience is knowing exactly what you are waiting for and being ready when it arrives. I had been ready. I intended to stay ready. The Keth frontier framework would hold, or it would need revision, or the world would change around it and something new would need to be built. That was the nature of all agreements. They are not destinations. They are foundations. We had a foundation now. Built honestly, in our own space, on our own terms, by a species that had been in deep space for 80 years and had, in that time, learned one essential truth: the universe does not give you a seat at the table. You build the table. You show up with your own chair. And when someone tells you to sit behind the railing and stay quiet, You read everything in the room, and you wait, and you make sure that when you finally speak, every word counts. I walked off the transport into the Geneva evening. The air was cool. The streetlights were coming on. Somewhere above the cloud cover, a ship was making its way toward the corridor, carrying something important in the hold, following a route that someone had built and someone maintained and that, for the foreseeable future, ran exactly where we said it ran. I thought about what Claire's brother had asked. What does it feel like to refuse to apologize for existing? It feels, I thought, like being exactly where you are supposed to be. That was enough. It had always been enough. We had simply needed the galaxy to understand it. Now it did.